folks. You are listening to the Yishai Fleisher Show here on Voice of Israel Broadcasting from Jerusalem. What a pleasure to be with you. In studio with me today is an amazing journalist. His name is Matti Friedman. He's a reporter, and his work has taken him to places like Lebanon and Morocco, Cairo, Moscow, Washington, and of course to our regional conflict here in Israel and also the Caucasus. He has been a correspondent for the AP, where he specialized in religion and archaeology in Israel and also in the Palestinian areas, as well as for the Jerusalem Report and Times of Israel. He is also an author, and we're going to talk about that in the second segment. He has written a book that has been very critically acclaimed called the Aleppo Codex. But the way that Matti got onto my radar screen was through an article that he wrote right now on Tablet Magazine. And this article made waves in the Jewish world. It's called An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. And the subline is, a former AP correspondent explains how and why reporters get Israel so wrong and why it matters. I think, though, that the title a little bit misleads. One of the big questions of the article is why? Why is Israel such a big deal in reporters' eyes and in the world's eyes when really there's many other stories? Certainly human carnage we are a small, tiny fraction of what happens in other places, even in urban Chicago. Here's a paragraph from Matti's latest article. Like many Jews who grew up in late 20th century in the friendly Western cities, I dismiss such ideas that the Jewish people are basically a symbol for everything that goes wrong. I dismiss such ideas as the feverish memories of my grandparents. One thing I have learned, and I'm not alone in this summer, is that I was foolish to have done so. Today, people in the West tend to believe the ills of the age are racism, colonialism, and militarism. The world's only Jewish country has done less harm than most countries on earth and more good. And yet when people went looking for a country that would symbolize the sins of a new post-colonial, post-militaristic, post-ethnic dream world, the country they chose was this one. Israel is therefore the country to blame. We have Matti Friedman in our studios with us today. Matti, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You told me that this article made more waves than all of the other articles you've ever written. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I've never seen a response to anything I've ever written over the many years that I've been a journalist that has approached the response that this article has received. It's been shared as of a few hours ago on Facebook 65,000 times. Mm-hmm. It's
why
a lot of people are reading it.
Why do you think that is? I have my theories. What's your theory?
I think that a lot of people, especially people who are sympathetic to Israel, or at least not antagonistic toward Israel, live with the strange kind of dissonance when they're experiencing the news. And it was particularly extreme this summer because the news was so extreme. And they don't understand why what they know is not what they're seeing. And it's a very strange feeling that starts making you question your own sanity if you depend on the international media for your knowledge of the world. This article tries to explain the dissonance from inside the news organizations, and I think it has been greeted with a sigh of relief by a lot of people who haven't been able to make sense of the news they're seeing from this place.
One of the key points really is that the Jews traditionally have been this focal point to, as I was expressing before from your article, a kind of focal point of the world's ills. And that was a traditional idea. So my mother once told me, she's like, anti-Semites, what they accuse the Jews of is actually what they want to do. So if Hitler wants world control, he'll say the Jews want world control. If the jihadists say that Israel are baby killers, they themselves very well might be baby killers. Tell me some of the kind of innovations of thought, or at least the things that were revealed through this article that people reacted to.
I've been thinking about this for a while, about what exactly has gone wrong. I mean, it's clear. Some things are just objectively clear. When I started working at the AP had more than 40 full-time news staffers covering Israel and the Palestinians, and they had one part-time regime-approved stringer covering Syria. So the AP saw Syria before the Civil War as 1/40th as important as Israel, and that's objectively crazy. And if the West is asking itself, which it isn't, but it probably should be, why no one saw the implosion of the Middle East coming? Well, the answer, or one of the answers to that, is that the entire Mideast press corps was busy counting houses in settlements in the West Bank, and they weren't covering the story. But But to get deeper, you have to kind of ask why this story? I mean, why, when people are looking for the most important story on earth, as I call it in my headline, why they choose this one? And I think that the answer is linked to what you said. Jews have always been a lightning rod for negative sentiment. And they've always been a blank screen, a convenient blank screen. They were a minority that existed in many different countries in the West. And they were a blank screen onto which you would project things you didn't like about your own society. So if you wanted, as I write, if you wanted to condemn greed, you'd say Jews are greedy. If you wanted to condemn cowardice, you'd say Jews are cowards. And if you were a communist, you'd say Jews are bankers. And if you were a capitalist, you'd say Jews are communists. And that happens at exactly the same time in different parts of the world in the 30s and 40s and 50s. All this gets taken a bit too far in the 40s. And this kind of thing becomes unfashionable for a while, but such deep thought processes don't disappear. They just go into recession. And what we've seen this summer, and I think a lot of people who would rather have avoided it are not avoiding it anymore after what we've seen this summer, is that this thought pattern has returned. It's returned big time these days. People think that colonialism, racism, and militarism are the ills of the world. And the country that symbolizes these ills is the Jewish country.
So it symbolizes it, but that's not just a coincidental thing. It turns out today that when Israel fights a war, it fights it always on two fronts. There's the military front, and then there's what I call the narrative warfare. And it seems like Hamas, and their ilk, are masters of narrative warfare. They are masters of utilizing pictures and narratives and stories to such an extent that really changes the perception of what's happening on the playing field. And it seems a lot of times that the media are in cahoots with them. So you're saying it in a lot of fancy words, but the average person on the street would say, the media is anti-Semitic. But maybe there's a truth there. Maybe there is a bias there that is, maybe it's even funded or supported somehow by the other side.
I don't think it is. And I avoid in the piece and in general the word anti-Semitism, because I think anti-Semitism is a simple word for things that are very complicated and also often nuanced. A lot of this is in the gray zone. I don't think that the AP, which is the subject of the piece, is an anti-Semitic organization, and I don't think that the international reporters, at least not the vast majority of them, are anything that could be described as anti-Semitic. If you say anti-Semitism, it kind of allows us to avoid thinking about what exactly is going on.
Right.
And what exactly is going on, I think, is the attribution of negative characteristics to a familiar villain. And once you've thought of it that way, then things kind of become clear. What we've seen this summer is what you said. When Israel fights a war, it ends up fighting a war against the media. Hamas, because of the way the press corps has performed here in the past, let's say, decade, many of those years I was a witness, and that's the subject of the piece, Hamas has understood that when they go to war with Israel, the press corps, the foreign press corps, can be depended on to tell the story that Hamas wants them to tell. Right. So when it sits in the headquarters under Shifa Hospital and makes a decision about whether to escalate, that's one of its calculations. Hamas's story is that there are no Hamas fighters. There's no Hamas strategy. There are no launches from civilian areas, and all of the dead are civilians. And that's the story that the media told this summer, effectively allowing itself to be co-opted by the terrorist group that has parked itself on Israel's southern border and is openly dedicated to its destruction.
But by the way, it didn't just say it to the West. My Arab neighbors in eastern Jerusalem fully believe that Israel massacred Arab children, and that story was told maybe even more successfully within the Arab world, galvanizing a lot of Arabs who when you talk to them, they kind of come out of a stupor, but in there, when they're watching TV, they believe it. They believe it very much. And there was amazing stuff that happened with Israel and storylines. For example, my next door neighbors, most of them believe very much, for example, that those 3 boys were not killed by Hamas, but were killed in a car accident on the way down to Eilat, and it was used. But it wasn't conspiracy theory. You know how we poo-poo conspiracy theory? No, that was it. Now, I want to talk about a different theory. I love a paragraph that you wrote that says, an observer might legitimately frame the story of Israel through the lens of minorities in the Middle East, all of which are under intense pressure from Islam. When minorities are helpless, their fate is that of the Yazidis or Christians of northern Iraq, as we have just seen. And when they are armed and organized, they can fight back and survive, as in the case of the Jews, i.e. Israel, and we must hope the Kurds. What I like about it so much is that I even think of ISIS as this as this icebreaker that actually challenges that narrative of a huge Israel against a small Arab minority. No, we are a small minority within, I call it a Jewish autonomy, within a grander Arab Middle East. And that's a legitimate way to frame it, but we don't see that in the media.
One of the ways that the story has been falsified is by framing it as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that is kind of a linguistic kung fu move that has successfully been carried out after 1967. And it changes the way people see the conflict, because if you think it's a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, then you think it is a conflict between a Jewish majority and an Arab minority. And the Jews in that story are the stronger side. If you understand the history of this place, you understand that this is a conflict that has been going on since the early 20th century, if not earlier. It's been going on for 100 years. It was going on before the state of Israel existed. It was going on before Israel conquered the Palestinian areas of Gaza and the West Bank. It was going on before the word Palestinians was used to denote anyone other than Jews living in Palestine. It allows you to delude yourself into thinking that this is a conflict that is taking place on land that the Jews control, which is 0.2% of the Arab world, and that it will be solved if the Palestinian predicament can be solved. Now, the Palestinian predicament is genuine, and Palestinian distress is genuine. If the Palestinian problem is solved tomorrow, the conflict will continue. Any informed observer looking at the Middle East understands that. So the formulation of this conflict as Israeli-Palestinian is a fiction that allows the story to be warped and prevents, I think, the average news consumer from understanding what's going on and the depth of the conflict here.
And that is mechuvan. That is an architecture behind it. It is not random. There is an effort to distort it, to warp that story, and it works in favor of those groups who want to see Israel weakened.
I agree. By the way, I don't think the average reporter understands that. Right. I don't think the average reporter is sitting down and trying to warp the story.
But he may be co-opted.
Many of them are co-opted, certainly. I think a lot of them don't understand. I think a lot of the reporters here simply don't know what's going on. I was sent in 2008 to cover the Russian invasion of Georgia, and I knew nothing. I mean, I knew less than nothing. I arrived in Georgia, and about 15 hours after landing in Georgia for the first time, I found myself in a Russian army convoy invading Georgia, and I didn't know which way was north. I didn't speak a word of Georgian or of Russian. I had no idea of the complicated history of Georgia and the Soviet Union. I knew nothing, and I was reporting for the world's biggest news organization. I was the Western world's eyes on this conflict, and I had no right to be. I had no credibility and no background in the conflict. And being there and feeling as helpless as I did helped me understand how a lot of foreign journalists here see this place.
We're speaking with Matti Friedman. He's the author of a very popular article, an explosive article called An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. He's a journalist, and we will be right back with him talking about his incredible new book right here on the Yishai Fleisher Show. Stay tuned.
This is the Voice of Israel. Voice of Israel.
All right, folks, you are listening to the Yishai Fleisher Show. We're here with Matti Friedman, a reporter who has been a correspondent for the AP, who's written a new article called The Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. And he got on my radar screen when this article was published on Tablet and everybody was talking about it. And I learned also that he's the author of a highly acclaimed book called the Aleppo Codex. Let me tell you a little bit about it. 1,000 years ago, the most perfect copy of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was written. It was kept safe through one upheaval after another in the Middle East, and by 1940 it was housed in a dark grotto in Aleppo, Syria, and has become known around the world as the Aleppo Codex. Matti Friedman's book is like a detective story that goes through the smuggling from hiding places in Syria and how it got to Israel, and how also many pages actually got lost in this Aleppo Codex. Matti, thank you so much for being in studio with us today. It sounds to me like you had a real life adventure chasing the story of the Aleppo Codex. Tell me a little bit about it.
That's for sure. In 2008, in the summer of 2008, I was in the same building where the Dead Sea Scrolls are kept at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and I walked down into the basement of the building and discovered another manuscript there that I'd never heard of, even though I grew up in an educated Jewish home. I understood from the labels that this was the most important copy of the Tanakh, of the Bible in Hebrew, and I'd never heard of it. And that struck me as being very weird. An investigation that started as an AP article ended up being a book that took me to some very weird and wonderful places.
I've heard of the Aleppo Codex, and I think the ROM Baum used it as well, Maimonides?
That's right. It was ROM Baum's Tanakh. The manuscript that you can see in the Israel Museum was on ROM Baum's desk in Cairo in the 12th century.
That's
it gives you chills.
Yeah, that's an amazing book, but it somehow in the end didn't have this. It somehow got in this situation where it was no longer kept in the highest best places. It was somehow kind of lost. How does something like that get lost? How do pages get lost?
Well, it was never lost. It was kept for 600 years in a safe in a grotto in the Great Synagogue of Aleppo, Syria, which was a city which has been in the news recently for terrible reasons, but was home to a Jewish community that was a couple centuries old by the time the Second Temple was destroyed. So one of the world's oldest Jewish communities, continuous Jewish presence in Aleppo until the 1990s. And in 1947, there's a riot in Aleppo after the UN votes to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, and the Codex disappears. And my book picks up after the disappearance of the Codex and tries to figure out what exactly happened to this manuscript after it supposedly disappeared in 1947. It resurfaced mysteriously 10 years later in Jerusalem, but much of it was missing.
Aleppo is not only a cradle of Jewish civilization, it's a cradle of human civilization, and it's being systematically destroyed. Pictures that I saw from Aleppo see really a town in the process of being flattened. Can you comment a little about that? And I guess also back to your article, the world does not seem to care that much. They don't care that much. They're not interested that much. You pointed out in your article that the almost 200,000 people murdered in the Syrian civil war is much, much more than the whole Israel-Arab conflict combined in all of its 100-year history. And yet the world doesn't seem to care.
That's right. I think one of the things that is so disturbing about the way this conflict is seen is the numbers. The numbers just don't add up. If you look at other conflicts on Earth, we're just not on the map. And as an Israeli who would like to see peace in this place, the violence here is of deep concern to me, as it is of concern to all of us, Jews and Arabs. Between 2006 and 2012, as I read in my article, 60,000 people died in drug wars in Mexico that no one cares about. Nearly 200,000 people have died in 3 years in Syria, which is about 80,000 more than have ever died in the supposedly globally significant Israel-Arab conflict. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is that specifically people in the media, need to regain a sense of proportion, because the proportion attributed to this particular conflict has gotten out of control, and it has nothing to do with the human toll of the conflict itself.
Speaking of human, you have written this book. You used to work for AP. Your book won the 2014 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, was selected one of the book list's top 10 religion books of the year, was awarded the American Library Association's Sophie Brody Medal, and so on. You got a lot of awards for that book, and I wanted to ask you about yourself a little bit. You're Israeli. You speak Hebrew fluently. You're not a kippah-wearing Jew. You profess to also be a liberal and left-leaning on political issues. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you, Matti Friedman, and how'd you get to here?
Not as interesting as the stuff I write about. I was born in Toronto, and I moved here when I was 17 in 1995, and I started out on a kibbutz called Ma'ale Gilboa, which is a religious kibbutz up north, near Beit She'an.
You moved to Israel when you were 17?
I came to Israel when I was 17, expecting to stay for a year.
Are your parents Israeli?
No, my parents are not Israeli. They moved themselves a few years later. I got drafted when I was 19, and I served for a few years in the military, went to university, started working as a journalist. I live in Jerusalem and have 3 kids. That's pretty much it.
Oh, that's okay. But it's interesting that your perspectives also on the Arab-Israel issue, they seem to mirror some of the perspectives of those very journalists that don't have that, how did you call it? The numbers don't add up by them. You very much are concerned with the Palestinian plight, with the Arab plight. Tell me a little bit about them within the context of Gaza, of this last war, a war that I think from your writing seemed to have been also justified in part. But what about...
I think the Israeli war in Gaza this summer was completely justified, and if anything, might have ended before it should have. The idea that Israel should just live with terrorists firing rockets at its people is an idea that no one here accepts, except for a very small fringe. And I think most of us, the vast majority of us in the polls bore this out during the war, are in the same place. It didn't used to be that way. Of course, there were huge political divides here in the 90s about the right way forward. But now, the disagreement within Israeli society is quite muted. And that is one of the, I guess you could say, positive effects of being surrounded by enemies. Our internal disagreements don't seem that important when we're facing the threats that we're facing. I think we're all on the same page. I think we're all on the same page this summer. And I think we're all equally worried about the very serious and scary threats that we're seeing beyond our borders.
Matti, I want to tell you, Matti Friedman, journalist and author, I want to tell you that this morning I had a conversation with one of my Arab neighbors, and I said to him, he said to me, how do you explain to my son how come Israel has killed so many Arabs? And I said to him my line, which is, look, that's what happens when you mess with Israel. Don't mess with us because you're shooting rockets at us and we shoot back. And he said, don't tell me you think you won. I said, yeah, of course we won. It was a fight in the schoolyard. You pushed us. We pushed back. He says, you can frame it that way, but your media has framed it in terms that you lost. Everybody that I hear on your media say that you lost, and therefore we think that we won.
That's interesting. I actually think that the word victory needs to be reassessed in 2014 because wars don't work like they used to work, and victory isn't on the battlefield. No one's going to win. There's not going to be a winner and a loser anymore. It's not that the other side is going to turn tail and run, and there's not going to be a white flag. The other side is always going to claim victory. Victory and defeat happen in the center. Victory and defeat happen, in our case, in Tel Aviv. And if you look at what Tel Aviv is and what Gaza City is, if you look at what Tel Aviv is and what Aleppo is, if you look at what Tel Aviv is and what Baghdad is, I don't think there's any question about who won this summer and who's winning every day.
Right. And that goes back to the issue of what is Hamas's real goal? Is their goal to disrupt our life? Yes. Is it to shut down the South? Yes. But that's not their big goal. Their big goal is to try to undermine the state of Israel.
One of the great things about Hamas is that they're totally open about what they want.
Right.
It's one of the
but not totally open, right? So the media
depends what language they're speaking. But in Arabic, they're pretty clear about what they want, and what they want is our destruction.
And yet, it does seem, I don't like this word that people use, the world. I don't like that, the world, because I think there's a much bigger world than the world. But it does seem that not everybody gets that. And that bothers Israelis. That bothers Jews. We still act in self-defense, and that's the way that's our narrative of this summer's war. Yet, that narrative isn't so clear on American campuses, in media, in places like Norway. That's not so clear. Do you have any ideas for how to get that message clear, or is it a lost cause?
I wish I could be more positive. I think it's basically a lost cause. And I think that when we act, we have to understand what we're facing and take it into account. We have to have a firm moral compass for our own reasons, and not because the world is going to jump up and down. We have to do what we need to do. We have to be as civilized as possible, but we're not going to be able to make these people happy.
Matti Friedman is a reporter. He has been all around the world. He has been a correspondent for the Associated Press, and he has written a book called the Aleppo Codex. I think he's got another book coming soon, but his first book, the Aleppo Codex, was published in 2012 by Algonquin, and he won many prizes for it. It chases and traces the story of this incredible document, this incredible Bible, the Hebrew Bible that was lost and returned. He's also the author of The Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth, about how media gets Israel's story very wrong. He lives in Jerusalem. Matti Friedman, thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, you are listening to the Yishai Fleisher Show, Voice of Israel. Stay tuned, folks. More great stuff is on the way. And shalom. Hey, folks, Yishai Fleisher here from Voice of Israel. We do hope that you enjoyed that content, but there's so much more, and you've got to stay connected. So click the link below and plug in.